episode of K&K Real Talk. I am here with the beautiful Krista Dennett, and she is a specialist in pelvic floor therapy. And I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. I know tons and tons of women in general and women with endo want to know more about pelvic health and how to keep it strong and things like problems with incontinence. So we'll get into a little bit about that. But before we do, why don't you introduce yourself and let people know what it is that you do exactly?
All right, so my name's Krista, and I go by Pelvic Floor Fitness here on Instagram, and KD Fitness. I work at a physiotherapy clinic that specializes in pelvic floor health, and my role is a pelvic floor physiotherapist support worker, and I do exercise rehab to help treat women with pelvic floor dysfunction symptoms. And I've been doing this for 6 years now, but finally in the last 6 months, I've been able to collaborate with a physiotherapy clinic. So before that, I was getting referrals from either doctors or sometimes physios or women just finding me, and then having to try to collaborate with a physiotherapist was a little bit of a challenge. Now we work together, and so between the 6 to 8 week span, or 4 to 6 weeks depending on what the client needs, they work with me on a weekly basis to help heal from the symptoms that they have. And it's all based on movements, exercise movements that I like to call release, retrain, and re-strengthen pattern. And and as far as the type of women that I work with, there's women who are postpartum, women who are pregnant, women who are in perimenopause. So it really spans all ages and whatever stage you are in. I also have clients online actually with endometriosis. So I do know a little bit about that and how pelvic floor physiotherapy and pelvic floor exercise rehab can help with something as specific as that. So that's in a nutshell what I do. My background from a physical education perspective is I specialized in pelvic floor exercise rehab in January 2014. I work as a master trainer for a company online called Bellies Inc., who their job is to help educate fitness professionals like myself and train fitness professionals like myself on how to apply exercise in conjunction with pelvic floor physiotherapy. They also have, they call it the ABRAP system. So it's a postpartum gentle rep device for women in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And then of course I have my own online program, which I'm actually in the process of revamping because of all of the most amazing condensed information that I've learned in the last 6 weeks at the pelvic floor physiotherapist clinic and working there. So hopefully in the new year, I'll have something very specific online that's a little bit different than you might see out there right now. That is what I do in a nutshell.
That's awesome. So let's talk about women specifically. And quick question, do you work with men? I know that men have some pelvic floor dysfunction as well.
Yes, I have worked with men in the past. There aren't really a lot of men that come to the clinic, mostly because we're a women's health-based clinic, although there are men who the physios do see. And yes, they have pelvic floor dysfunction issues as well. They can get hernias, groin injuries, just back pain, hip pain. The muscles that form the inner core unit are exactly the same as women, just how the symptoms present themselves in men can be different. So they don't normally get they won't get incontinence. Instead of maybe a prolapsed organ, they'll get hernias up the abdominal area. And then of course, what I hear and see often is back and hip pain in men. Mm-hmm.
So for women, specifically just women in general, why is pelvic floor physiotherapy good to do?
So whether you've had a baby or not, the muscles, specifically the pelvic floor muscles, do change and weaken as we age. partly because our muscles naturally weaken if we're not conditioning them as we age, but also hormonal changes. So every woman should see a pelvic floor physiotherapist at some point in their life, just to make sure that the muscles are functioning as they should. It is sort of that hidden area of our body that we don't think about until something happens. And even when something does happen, and typically in women that haven't had any symptoms, say in postpartum, and they hit about 40 or 50, they'll start getting incontinence, or maybe the start of a prolapse, or maybe they've had back and hip pain that has aggravated them the entire time since having babies, or for whatever reason, not realizing that it was pelvic floor based. We ignore those things. So if we had, say, a shoulder injury, or we had torn a muscle in our leg or arm, we'd go get help for that. But we seem to ignore things like incontinence and back pain and hip pain, and we just sort of go along with it. But in fact, there's a whole treatment available to help us, both preventative and to eliminate symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction. So it's really important, and it's something that it's been around long enough, but it hasn't been talked about, because that's sort of a taboo thing to talk about, leaking after pregnancy. Even when I talk about it with my mom, she was lucky. She didn't have any symptoms, and even she had to have a hysterectomy, and she didn't have any issues from that. So she's one of like the very small percentage, and she thinks that everybody doesn't have a problem. It's like, no, we just didn't talk about it. And actually it's so prevalent. And that's something that the reason I got into it is because when I originally started out in the fitness industry over 10 years ago, and I was teaching group fitness classes, I would watch these women race out to the bathroom in the middle of class, or they would go preventative pee before the class. They talk about their hip pain or their back pain after class, their bellies that were like they're not getting flat even though they're exercising. So I had my own symptoms too. I didn't have leaking, but I had a hernia, I had a separation, and I had a mild prolapse that I didn't know about. And so it wasn't until thankfully all these women were talking about it that I decided to go and investigate it further. And that's how I started my journey to get into where I am today.
So what is it exactly that causes incontinence?
Well, it can be a number of things. Most common is pregnancy. Weakening of the pelvic floor muscles is generally, for general incontinence, weakening of the pelvic floor muscles is the common cause. Also, prolapse of internal organs. So when the bladder is starting to push against the vaginal wall and descending down. So if this is the inside of the vagina and the bladder's pushing in this way, then it becomes a little pool of urine that can hold in there and not completely eliminate. So what happens is you think you're done, and then you go and you go and do something, and you might find all of a sudden you're leaking. The other thing is when we are pregnant, or lifestyle, for example, our lives see us sitting a lot, whether it's for commuting to work, working, relaxing, whatever it is, our pelvis can be put into a position that doesn't allow our internal inner core unit to function the way it wants to. So posture is also very important when we have this inner core unit of muscles firing. And what I should clarify, when we talk about inner core unit, it's not just the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor co-contracts with these transverse abdominals that are deep internal core muscles that wrap around you like a corset. They are directly linked to the flow of our diaphragm. And then there's muscles up our spine called the multifidus that also co-contract with the pelvic floor. So this is this inner core unit, and it is also responsible for stability. So as we age, and what we see a lot of is older people falling and breaking a hip or whatnot. That is a lot to do with the weakening of the inner core unit as well. Incontinence and prolapse is the second reason next to dementia that a lot of women are admitted to old age care. And so that's something that could have been completely prevented if we just knew about it or did something about it earlier in life. Yeah.
Wow, I'm definitely learning things because after my hysterectomy, if I cough too hard, I definitely pee my pants.
Hmm. Yep.
My boyfriend works at an old age home and he sees lots of broken hips, so that's interesting. Maybe someone should be like going in and like, is there a way to prevent that? Like
Yeah, I
just
mean,
work.
absolutely. Muscles at any age can always um, be conditioned and strengthened, albeit the longer it's gone without any treatment or work, the longer it takes to, but there is simple things, even for the aging population, that they can do. Um, just teaching a woman in her later years to do a Kegel. A lot of them don't even know what that is or how to do it. And something is just getting them starting with that, with their breathing, can be helpful. And, depending on, like I said, what stage they're at in life, hopefully it can help a little bit.
So like what are some examples of like a few things that people can do at home just to strengthen those muscles again?
The first thing is to, the first thing is really like, let's look at our breathing. When we naturally in North America, we have a lifestyle that's very rushed, very stressed, and our breathing, because we call shallow, so we become chest breathers. And if I watch, I would say majority of my clients, I come in and I have them just sit down and I watch them breathe, and they're always, that's how they're breathing. We want to take our breath down into our lower area of our body. So just sitting there and practicing breathing and hands on your rib cage and working on focusing breathing into the ribs and into the belly and into the lower or mid back is the first step that we can do to help with retraining our pelvic floor function. Because if our breathing is shallow and tense, our body and muscles are tense. And there's a lot to be said about relaxation and breath that we hear a lot, say in yoga or meditation, to settle the body down into a parasympathetic state, to allow the muscles to relax and flow as they are supposed to. From there, we can then start to feel what a Kegel should feel like, but we want to have it flow with the breath. So we want to inhale to expand, and then exhale and contract the pelvic floor, and inhale and expand, and so on. So something as simple as that, just to get started, is key. But what I want to stress is that pelvic floor contraction is not like you're lifting a heavy weight bicep curl. It's a very gentle ebb and flow type contraction, because the pelvic floor anticipates movement. When we go to take a step, it fires. That's why if you go to say take a step and there's some ice and you slip, it's already will anticipate that quick sudden movement. And if it's strong enough and the core unit's strong enough, it can prevent you from falling over. And I've actually had a case where I've slipped on ice and almost went completely horizontal, and then came right back up. So it just goes to show how important that is, and that it works without us even knowing it. So bringing it into our awareness and retraining it is important. And then the next step is we need to retrain it in movement. So we need to be able to teach it how to function as it should in our conscious awareness in movement, so that when we are naturally moving in life, then we know it's got a chance to fire and flow as it's supposed to.
That is great advice because I do notice the last few months my life's gotten a bit busier, so I haven't had my time to kind of like I still meditate every day, but I kind of was doing it more in the day. So I haven't had that time to kind of check in with myself, be aware, check my breathing, and I totally noticed that I am breathing shallow again, and
Mm-hmm.
I've got less energy because of that. So
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people just take breathing for granted. Yes, we do it every day. We just do it naturally, but that doesn't mean we're doing it properly.
Exactly. And if our breathing is labored and stressed, so is the rest of our body. So that's the first opportunity to make sure that at least the pelvic floor, we can get connected with it, is with our breath. And then the other thing is I check in with my pelvic floor all the time throughout the day. I've had 3 children of my own. I had a C-section and I had 2 naturally. So I've had all the possible birthing styles you could have between episiotomy and having surgery for C-section. And so I just make sure that throughout the day, even if I go for a run, can I feel my pelvic floor in my run? Can I contract it in my run? I don't need to sit there and go contract, release every time I take a step. But I just want to make sure that, oh, it's there, it's firing, we're good. And that's how I treat it, because I do a higher level of exercise. I do CrossFit, I run. So I want to make sure that in those practices that I'm doing things safely and not, I mean, I could easily aggravate my symptoms again and be in trouble if I'm not constantly being aware of it. And one thing I want women to know is that in the rehab retraining process, it does take patience. I try to make it so that my clients are doing something for 15 minutes a day. I try to make it within their lifestyle reasonableness, but I also may need to make them aware that it's something that will always be on our mind. In your case, you've had a hysterectomy. There's something that you can have a prolapse of the vaginal vault. So you need to maintain that strength as well. Women who have had babies, the more babies you've had, the weaker and longer it takes to rehab. So, there's all these things that we just need to be aware of so that down the road, we're preventing ourselves from having issues that, significantly change our quality of life. Yeah.
I totally agree. I don't think that, like, I think as women, we're so busy micromanaging our lives, our husbands' lives, girlfriends' lives, our children's lives, that we like forget to check in with ourselves and be mindful and take that time to meditate. I've been using the expression "you can't pour from an empty cup" lately, and I've been focusing on self-care so that if I'm at my best, I can be my best for whomever else I have to be.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest thing that women miss, and this was my issue as well when my kids were younger, is that I felt guilty if I wasn't focusing on them. And that if I took a moment for myself, I was a bad mom. And I struggled with that. And my kids are now 16, almost 14, and 10. And there are days where I still go back to that thought process, but then I've realized that I'm much better to them if I have taken time for myself in the day too. And it's not easy. I have women with all different situations, work situations, this and that. So they realize that at the end of the day, when they haven't even been able to find 15 minutes for themselves, or 10 minutes even, or even 5 minutes, because sometimes all I ask is just breathe and do your Kegels for 5 minutes. And when they realize they can't find that, they break down. And then that's where we need to so a lot of the times there's this sort of underlying therapy that I go through with my clients is let's get you focusing on yourself. You will be better for it to your children, to your husband, to your friends, to the rest of your family, if you just take care of yourself, and a role model too. I mean, what are we telling our children if we're not taking care of ourselves? So, and it's just fitting it in. And I know for me, I would stay at home mom for a majority of my kids' time. The stuff that I do from fitness was from home, so I could juggle it around them as they got older. Now I'm out of the house more, going to the clinic. So even finding time for myself is a struggle, and I recognize that, but I make it a priority, and that's just how I have to do it. Otherwise, I'd be in the same boat as everybody else.
Exactly. I think we forget about ourselves way too often.
Hmm.
Oh, what specifically for women with endo happens to the pelvic floor, and what can we do to help what's happening? Like, is for endo specifically, is it a weakening, or is it like it's too tight?
Uh, for endometriosis, because one of the key symptoms is pain, often the muscles can become very tight. And we call that hypertonic because they're just constantly like, oh, like you're just in so much pain, especially around the menstrual time. And so a couple of things to do is to, I always say, have a women's health physiotherapist see you, because they can do an internal exam and assess the function of the muscle. So if they are what we call hypertonic, meaning they're constantly in a tense state, that doesn't mean that they're strong. It just means that they can't relax. And then what will happen is that once they relax, then they don't have function, or we call it they're weak. So we have to retrain them to function on and off and on and off with breath. The things that you can do once you know what your symptoms are from a pelvic floor muscle perspective is, if it's hypertonic, the physiotherapist can do a myofascial release of the muscles. But unless you're doing that consistently, it can go back to the tense state. So a lot of women have successfully used a variety of dilators to help internally massage the muscle. And I can, not having endometriosis myself, but I can gather that when you're in that severe pain state, it's going to be hard to do something like that. So that's someplace where breathing, and I call them my release exercises, are going to be key, because when your pelvic floor is tense, other muscles are taking over to compensate for its lack of ability to fire. And so just simply doing release exercises, I call them, for other parts of the body can be helpful. And just maybe during that main painful extreme time, to avoid doing any dilator. Some of the release exercises are very simple. I call them exercises, but they're stretches. But I find that if women associate exercise with it, they take it more seriously. And funny enough, when they do it and do it consistently, and they realize it actually makes a big difference. So I'll do things to work on relaxing the glute muscles, the hip flexors, the psoas, hamstrings, opening up the rib cage, obliques can get tight. So anything to just try to release tension in other parts of the body is key. And then once the pain is starting to subside again, then we can go back in and work on some of the release work for the muscles, the internal muscles. And there are release exercises and movement practices we can do to help focus on relaxing the pelvic floor, and then focus on retraining into Kegel again. So that, to me, I mean, I've had one client online who has, it happens to everybody. She's been on and off, and she noticed when she was doing it, things were better. And then when she wasn't doing the work, it started to get aggravated again, and the pain would come back. So yeah, just, it's really individual. If we can stick to it, then it is helpful.
So would you recommend doing yoga daily?
Yoga is definitely, absolutely. It depends on what type of yoga, first of all. If we're looking at power yoga, there's a lot of intense movements in it. Muscles that are already overworked could continue to be overworked. So it's not quite as relaxing, but something like a vinyasa or a general hatha could be good. Just like in rehabbing the pelvic floor muscles, if there is hypertonicity, but then also weakness, which you can have, because once the muscles start to relax and there's weakness, there are certain movements that we want to be careful of. For example, anything like forward flexion can put pressure on the abdominal wall and on the pelvic floor if we don't have that function and reconnection back. But I don't want to, my goal is not to stop people from doing what they enjoy. So if yoga is what they enjoy, coupled with they're getting some help from a pelvic floor physio or somebody who's experienced in exercise rehab with respect to pelvic floor, then absolutely we want to work on increasing their pain-free zone. So always work within your pain-free zone. So if a movement doesn't feel right, do something different. That's where the exercise rehab education comes in. So if they know that doing a boat pose is going to cause them problem, well, the exercise rehab they've been doing has alternatives for them to work on, while the rest of the class is doing that. Because it's not very common to find a lot of yoga instructors around North America, or even personal trainers that are specific pelvic floor focused. So we just want to watch for that.
Okay, awesome. So before we wrap up here, where can everyone find you? Where are you located? What is the clinic that you work out of?
So I work out of a clinic here just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, called Bump Physio and Co. in a city called Port Moody. So anybody that is in this area that watches can come and see me there in person. I also do work online, albeit I've kind of put that on hold for the last 6 months because I've gotten so busy at the clinic, but this has also given me a great opportunity. And like I said, I've revamping my programs for online purpose, because I found that I want to work with women who have a good understanding of what their symptoms are. So there are a lot of pelvic floor physiotherapists around that we're able to find, but they're not a lot of exercise rehab coupled with it. So when you see a pelvic floor physiotherapist, it is their priority to do the manual manipulation work and send you away with a few things to do. What we've shown in the last 6 months, doing it very condensedly and consistently with clients, is when they worked with somebody like myself for either every week or every other week over a 6 to 8 week period, we significantly reduced their symptoms or eliminated them depending on what they were. So I've created separate 6-week programs for if you have incontinence only, if you have incontinence with prolapse, if you have abdominal separation, diastasis. Some of the stuff that I do there is different than if you didn't. If you have just low back and hip pain. And then of course, because I've already have a couple clients online and in clinic who have endometriosis, there's one specific for that. So it's kind of like you can pick what you get or what you need, and making it more focused that way. So that's in the works right now, because I just want to really make sure that I've done my little case study with all the clients that I've had so far in the last 6 months to make sure that I've honed in on it and we see the results, which we're getting it rolling in over and over again, the improvements. So for the meantime, people can follow me on Instagram at Pelvic Floor Fitness, or they can go to my website. It's www.kdfitness.ca and just sign up for my, I have some online video information, so they can get that, and that gets into my mailing list. So when I'm ready to launch these programs specifically, then they can be the first to know.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on K&K Real Talk. I so appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and I am so glad that we were able to spread the word about pelvic floor health.
So if you guys have any questions for Krista, if you have questions about pelvic floor that you're interested in, I know there's tons of women who ask about it, just put a question in the comments or send me a DM and we will get the questions answered for you. As always, we love you and have a great night.